Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We're really thrilled to have Mike with us. And just a few housekeeping notes. We will have a couple knowledge checks throughout. So you'll see those. You can answer those in Zoom, but those are not toward your CPE. We will also have the CPE questions pop up right in the center of your screen. You should hear a ding when you see those as well. But if you have any questions or tech issues, please feel free to reach out to me in the chat. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Jim to introduce Mike. Thanks,
All
guys.
right. Thank you, Tiffany. Appreciate it. Well, welcome everybody. We're glad you're here today on behalf of the Colorado Society of CPAs and also the TUG group, the Technology Users Group. And I'll have to put a plug in for us. Mike and I are members of this, and there's some other people on this call. If you're looking for technology and some good tech talk, discovery, education, vendors, come to our monthly meeting. We'd love to have you. So Mike is a cybersecurity expert. We're glad to have him here from NTM Advisory, and the title of his presentation today is Defend or Just the Crown Jewels: Strategies for Optimized Scoping of Your Risk and Compliance Program. Thank you again, Mike, for joining us and presenting your skill set and your wisdom. And we look forward to hearing from you. If you've got questions along the way, put them in the chat. I'll try to monitor those for Mike, and we'll make sure we get to your questions. Without further delay, Mr. Mike, if you would, sir.
Excellent. Thanks for the time, Jim. Thanks, Tiffany, and thanks everyone for showing up. I know we all have a lot of demands on our time, and I appreciate you sharing some of your Wednesday with me. I would also say that I want and encourage and appreciate engagement, questions, participation. I'm not going to just drain slides for 50 minutes. So, I will be able to talk for 50 minutes if nobody asks any questions. I anticipate Jim might have one or two that he might be able to chime in, but also, please ask questions, chime in. This is intended to be engaging, and as the title implies, there's a duality here. There isn't a single answer. There isn't a single right answer for how an organization approaches risk and compliance. So I welcome dissenting opinions and challenges to my thinking. All right. So as I was pondering, how can I grab people's attention? I was thinking about, defend the kingdom, crown jewels, the battle, cyber attack kind of motif. And I went to my friends at in the artificial intelligence world, and I came up with, what would the Battle of Helm's Deep in the Lord of the Rings trilogy look like if it was amongst auditors? And so here we are, setting the stage, us with our suits and ties and our spreadsheets going into battle. I still haven't run into any of those dragons or whatever flying beings there are, but the rest of it sometimes feels like my client environments, I will say. So after a little bit of, hopefully, a few chuckles, what are we going to talk about today? So when we're thinking about and when I'm supporting my clients in their IT and cybersecurity risk or compliance journeys, I typically try and go on this a similar arc as this presentation. So, we'll start with scope. What is scope? Why is scope so important when you're thinking about risk and compliance? What's most important to protect? I think this is an incredibly important question to ask, because the answer isn't and it shouldn't be the same company to company to company. There are nuances, there are unique value propositions, there's strategic differentiators. And from a risk and compliance perspective, if you're not taking those business components into account, you're not building your program in the most pragmatic or effective way. This is also, this middle piece is where I absolutely would appreciate and want that dialogue, weighing the pros and cons. Like I said at the beginning, there's no single right answer to this. But it is important to have an answer that you and your organization agree with and are comfortable speaking to. And I'll close out, depending on how much time we have, talking about CMMC. So CMMC, I know this is an acronym and a concept that we've talked a decent amount at the Technology User Group about over the last months and quarters. CMMC stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, and it's a new enforcement to a long-standing requirement for organizations that support the Department of Defense. So both directly supporting Department of Defense as well as in the supply chain, the defense industrial base supply chain. So Colorado has a lot of aerospace and defense companies. So a lot of our colleagues and friends in this market are thinking about, are aware of, are worried about CMMC. And as an accounting firm or as an accountant or as a consultant, you may be in scope of your clients' CMMC obligations. So there is relevance, and it may vary client to client. And then certainly time for Q&A at the end. But please put them in the chat, raise your hand. Jim will help me moderate and pull people in. All right, leaning on the Greek philosophers, the beginning is the most important part of the work. Establishing scope is so important to building and maintaining a sustainable compliance program. I oftentimes in the information security world, we'll talk about how security doesn't equal compliance. Being compliant to a regulation doesn't necessarily mean that you're secure and you're not going to get hacked. And similarly, an organization that is secure may not be fully compliant with a regulation. I'm also adding in a third dimension of risk, where an organization can be both secure and compliant, but may not be effectively managing their business risk. And conversely, an organization may be comfortable with their risk posture and their risk, have a risk tolerance defined, but they may not be secure, by an industry definition, or they may not be compliant with all different regulations or frameworks that are out there. So we should have started with that. But these three concepts, I think they're not interchangeable, but they are certainly interrelated when you're talking about information security, compliance, and I say primarily IT and information security or cybersecurity compliance, and risk management. So starting with the compliance, and many organizations have compliance obligations based upon the business that they're in. Many of these compliance frameworks put the obligation on the entity to define their scope. Here are two examples. PCI, so any companies that store, process, or transmit credit cards, the very first step is determining the scope of review. Where can credit cards be? What is the cardholder data environment, the CDE? CMMC, similarly, but it's a different type of data. So CMMC, again, stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, and it's for organizations that are in the defense industrial base. So either directly provide services to the Department of Defense, or are in the supply chain, or subcontractors, or provide services to organizations that are in that supply chain. So it's kind of this isn't this isn't rocket science, and I'm not the only one coming up with, let's start with scope. Um, the next concept that I'll introduce is I think there's two fundamental ways that you can look at and think about scope. Start within or start without. Inclusive, nothing is in scope except the things that we put in the bucket, that we identify, we document that, yep, this system has credit card information that may be processed. Yes, this marketing application contains personally identifiable information. It is in scope of our compliance obligations. Everything else we care about ish as a business, but they're not, we're not going to apply the same level of discipline. Alternatively, there's the exclusive of everything is in scope unless we confirm that it's absolutely out of scope, right? And these approaches, I'd say sometimes you can have the discretion as a leader, as a risk practitioner to make that choice. Oftentimes you don't necessarily have full control over it. So think about a small organization where it probably doesn't make sense to create different policy sets for some applications versus other applications, right? It may be more efficient to take this exclusive approach of everything is in a scope except for that one application, that one SaaS application that has a different username and password, right? And inclusive, this may be a choice that is made as a business grows, where if you're going into a new market, so if you're a North American company that is going into Europe for the first time, and you want to make sure that you know what part of your technology environment is subject to GDPR, data privacy requirements, you may be very intentional about carving out and defining that boundary, that compliance boundary, or that risk boundary. Just like the yin and yang, neither is right or wrong, and they are right. They are both equal valid parts to the whole. All right. Crown jewels. I was going to ask the question. That's okay. So crown jewels is a term that is used a lot in technology, really to mean or to be equated to your most important assets. Oftentimes, if you hear a CIO or an IT practitioner talk about crown jewels, I would say more often it's thought about as the most important systems, your critical application, your banking application that underwrites loans that your organization or your bank may provide to your customers. Your SaaS application that you provide the service to your customer. One of the things that I want to encourage, I encourage my team members, my colleagues, professionals, is to think outside the box a little bit around what is the most important, what truly are critical assets to companies. As accountants within the CPA, space, company financials, absolutely, that's really important. That's near and dear to our hearts. We understand the potential implications of company financials getting into the wrong hands or being inappropriately manipulated, or accessed or impacted. So that is certainly something that resonates for you guys. But as you're working with your clients, also think about what feeds into and what may impact the business. Is it intellectual property? Is it the secret recipe to Coca-Cola that's in a air-gapped, non-connected, I don't know, physical piece of paper somewhere in Atlanta, underground? Is it availability and consistency of service? So think about Netflix, right? Yes, they have certain content that they own the rights to, but a lot of the streaming content that Netflix provides is not exclusive to Netflix. There's, you can get similar, you can buy the same movies via Amazon or via Apple Plus or via other things. So that like unique access to something special is not the most important thing there. It's is the service available when my customers want it, and is the quality of that delivery what they're expecting? It's okay if there's a blip, in the middle, if it's okay if the quality goes in and out for a second, but you want that video to play pretty darn quickly after they press play. Because otherwise they'll go somewhere else. So thinking about and thinking a little bit more, from a technologist perspective, I encourage people try to understand the business lens. As finance and tax professionals in COCP in the CPA field, put on different lenses from a technology perspective, from a risk perspective. You have a good finance lens, but also, think about and try and understand both your and perhaps your customers' most important assets. Start with a poll question for the audience. And I'll let you answer whether you want to answer for your own company or for a client, if that's who you're working with primarily. Can you confidently identify your organization's crown jewels? We've got about 30 participants, so we'll see when we get to, all right, good. Over half have responded. Maybe we'll give it another few seconds, and we'll pop it up there. And I appreciate that a few people responded with banana. All right, we'll go ahead and end the poll there. All right, so two people said very highly confident in your crown jewels. That's great. I think that's awesome to hear. 35 to call it 50% have said partially. We have an idea. IT may have a different opinion than the business, but we've thought about, generally we have a sense. And 18%, three people said not confident at all. I would say this is a fairly accurate representation in my mind. And I would perhaps love to have a follow-on conversation with those that said yes, highly confident, because our digital footprint and our organizations in 2025 highly interconnected with our customers, with our partners. This stuff is changing really, really fast, and I'd love to learn from you around what are some of the things that you're doing to give you that confidence, because the reality is most companies don't. They have a sense, they may have a list of the top 5 or a number of critical applications, but they're often blind spots, and sometimes there's no confidence at all, and that's a really scary place to be in as a risk practitioner, as a compliance manager, and as a business owner. All right, so we've identified hypothetically. So we've said, what is the scope? We understand that it's important to define the scope. We're considering whether to do inclusive or exclusive. Everything's in scope except for what we exclude, or nothing's in scope except for what we do include. Talked about crown jewels. I think crown jewels and your critical assets need to be part of your compliance and your risk management scope, whether they are the only thing, right? That's the inclusive approach, or whether they are one of many things, one of additional things that you're protecting, they must be in the scope. So how do you think about then what is the risk of taking that just the crown jewel approach or a broader sense? And this is something that internal organizations can do, but also I think of an area where third parties, independent assessors, auditors can add a huge value to our clients, where we can bring that unbiased and sometimes uninfluenced perspective of, well, there are these scenarios, these are potential impacts, these are potential reasons why an auditor. So if we are auditing against the compliance framework, we are going to be measuring and giving feedback. But if we are assessing or if we are advising and supporting pre-audit, we can give them the lens of, well, if an auditor is coming in to look at your ISO 27001, your information system, your ISMS, your management system, what are they going to be thinking about? What are the questions that they're going to be asking? How can we pressure test the risk of drawing the boundary? And if we are drawing a boundary, if we're drawing a small boundary, are we as a business comfortable with the risk that happens outside? I like thinking about the war analogy again, and the risk board game, where thinking about a couple different, two different countries, perhaps. Talk about Russia with vast land tracts. It'd be really difficult and really expensive to apply the same protections to the entirety of Russia as a country, compared to like Vatican City, where it is a very small defined, limited geographic space, where it would be a lot easier to apply the same principles and same requirements to, just a small space. Maybe two bad countries. Vatican is not exactly a war-making country, but I think the concept can hold. So thinking about, if you do take that crown jewels approach, as a large land mass may take, is the business okay with attackers, with threat actors, with potential corporate espionage, with them crossing their border, but not getting to their inner sanctum, not getting to the crown jewels? Are they willing to accept that risk, or not? And I think that's part of it. The last thing I'll say around assessing your risk is, this isn't something that you just do once. This is something that you have to build in as a habit, as a recurring activity, and doing it on different scales and different scopes. Oftentimes organizations will do a company-wide or enterprise system risk assessment once a year. A lot of companies also do vendor risk assessments to evaluate, what is the risk of a particular vendor. It's important. All of those risk assessments are important and valuable, as long as you're thinking about and aligning that risk assessment methodology to the strategy for, what are you trying to protect? What do you really care? Where are your assets? Or where are your most important assets? So let's talk maybe a little bit on the kind of pros and cons of these two different approaches. I tried to give a few different analogies and talk a little bit about why a team, why a compliance practitioner, risk practitioner may choose one or the other. But we can go into a little bit more detail. The other thing that I do want to anchor on also, and I think we sometimes forget this because this is a space that many of us live in, is that compliance is always a cost to the business. It is oftentimes organizations will describe it as non-discretionary cost because it is a cost of doing business, right? You can't you can't be a CPA, you can't sign off on, accounting statements if you haven't been licensed, if you don't maintain your license, right? That's a cost of doing business. But that is a hard cost to go to school, to sit for the exam, to maintain your license, right? So in some ways it's you need to get it, you need to invest there to get into, to be able to play on the field. But as risk professionals, as compliance professionals, it is important to realize that that is a cost to the business. And especially for smaller organizations, this is it's often an ignored cost or a underdocumented or underappreciated cost until it's not, right? When you get breached and you then realize or experience the consequence, the impact, it's because you are feeling the cost that you didn't spend, you didn't invest previously. Or if you get a fine, your regulator comes in and evaluates and identifies that you're not meeting all your obligations. There are some hard costs associated there, but it is a cost. And so I say that because while we may inherently, or I certainly inherently understand and agree in risk mitigation, a lot of business owners, business leaders don't necessarily, right? They may be totally focused and more singly focused on top line growth, revenue generation, customer impacting activities. So having that frame of mind and building that into the conversation you're having around how do we scope, how do we most efficiently and most effectively manage our compliance environment. So talking about some of the pros and the cons, so inclusive, Crown Jewels, Vatican City, maybe Liechtenstein, we'll talk a bit different small country. It's the tightest scope posture. So a pro is that you have clearly defined and you have, justification for why a set of data, an application, a set of users is in that scope. It's defensible by design. In order to put something in the scope bucket, you've had to look at it and say, yes, that needs to be protected. So you have that paper trail to say, this is why, this is how we've defined the scope. And yes, all of these assets, all of these systems meet the requirements, meet the criteria to be under, in scope of the compliance. And it's oftentimes a more efficient use of resources, right? It's, in the Russia example, it's not an efficient use of resources to try to deploy troops and protect your entire enterprise for many organizations, and especially ones that may not be in as highly regulated entities or highly regulated industries, or for startups or growing firms that have been able to fly under the radar of regulators. This might be the right answer because you have a small team, because your leadership hasn't been ready or had the appetite to make the larger investment. On the flip side, so what are some of the cons of this approach? There's a higher impact of missing scope. So in order to have the confidence that you've put everything that needs to go into the bucket, you need to have made sure that you looked at everything in your business and you didn't miss something that's under the rug or behind the plant or whatever, right? A regulator may come in, your auditor may come in, and they are going to pick up the rug. They're going to, look and shine lights in corners that perhaps you as a business were not necessarily looking. And if they do, and you take this inclusive scope, if they identify a system that they think should be in scope, you're kind of SOL. You're right. You've identified, they've now identified that a system that should have controls is not being controlled or does not have the same protections applied to it. There's also increased complexity of managing and communicating the expectations and managing the program. So I said early on, some organizations may have one set of policies for a certain application, certain departments, and a different set of policies for other parts of the business. There's a cost to maintain multiple policies, multiple control environments, multiple bodies of evidence. And depending upon the size, geographic scope of the organization, that cost can certainly add up. Is very important is it depends on an aligned interpretation of the rule or of the regulation. So I have an opinion. I've read the couple hundred pages of the CMMC assessment guide, and I have an opinion of what all of those words mean. If we brought in 3 other assessors, I guarantee you there will be nuances and there will be components where we disagree on our interpretation. And so, if we are taking an inclusive approach, and the auditor that comes in or the assessor that comes in fundamentally disagrees with your interpretation, you're also kind of, dead out of the gates where, okay, you're at odds. I think you can manage this risk by, having conversations. Oftentimes you can choose your audit firm, you can choose your assessor firm. And so making sure that as you're interviewing and determining who you're going to work with to do that external assessment, you have an alignment. I think you can mitigate this, but there is always that risk. On the flip side, so let's talk about some of the pros and cons of the whole kingdom, trying to approach it in the broader sense. In general, you're setting a higher common denominator. You're setting a higher kind of low watermark for your entire organization. Even less important systems benefit from being more secure. Oftentimes, attackers will get into a non-critical system, something that the business thought was decommissioned, an application or a server or a laptop that the business thought was decommissioned, and then they will work their way into something that's more important, but they get that initial foothold on something that's less important. So if you apply the risk and control principle to every single asset, you're reducing that likelihood of weak, vulnerable footholds that attackers can get onto. Sometimes it's simpler to communicate, right? I don't care if having 18 characters is a difficult password for your benefits, internal HR benefits. Our password policy is 18 characters with complexity for all of our applications, for all of our systems. Sometimes that's just a lot easier to communicate and easier to hold the line on, easier to enforce. And it also may reduce other risk mitigation costs. So cyber insurance is a really good example of this, where cyber insurance, obtaining insurance is a risk transference opportunity to reduce the downside impact of financial loss. Well, if you've applied a crown jewels approach, but you're trying to get cyber insurance for your entire company, your premiums are probably going to be a lot higher than if you applied the same controls to the entirety of the company. The insurance underwriter is going to say, that is riskier. We are going to pass on some of that risk via the cost of the premiums, or not even underwrite, not even approve a policy. So sometimes there's some downstream, not directly related costs that are generated by your scoping approach. Now, on the flip side, some of the cons of taking this everything's in scope. Audits and assessments can be more expensive, right? If, instead of we have these 50 laptops that can store and process CUI, controlled unclassified information. These 50 laptops are in scope of CMMC. You don't have to assess these 3,000 laptops over here. That's going to be a lot lower of an assessment cost than somebody coming in and assessing all 3,500 or whatever, 3,500 laptops. So, depending upon the frequency and the type of external assessment or validation that needs to occur, you should build in and think about that from a total cost of ownership perspective. The next bullet point there, I would say, is more of a perception challenge, and oftentimes I get this from CFOs, where do we have to spend all of this? Do we have to license every single user, device, network, location, fill in the blank? Do we have to do that? Well, if you take the exclusive approach where you're protecting everything, the answer is yes, flat out yes, which doesn't always make sense financially. Or at least, CFOs are going to push on that a lot more. It's just something that you have to manage, and so, a decision that you have to think about. And then also there's potentially a higher cost when change occurs. So a new regulation is introduced. You now have to uplift, you have to move that low watermark up everywhere as opposed to just, one little piece. M&A is another area where this can be a challenge as well, where, if you have a principle to apply the same controls to everything and you merge with another big entity that isn't taking that approach or may have a different control set, it's a very expensive exercise, and time consuming and resource intensive exercise to lift everything up. All right, I've been doing a lot of talking. We'll go on to another question, poll in the audience. And I would love, actually, I'm going to pause here before we go into the CMMC example. I would love some interaction, some questions, some pressure tests, some I disagree because. So we'll give it another minute or so to for the poll to run, and then talk about the answers, and then I'll move back to that last slide so we can talk about pros, cons, these different approaches. We're at 15 people have answered. Let's see if we can get one or two more. We'll end there. 15 people answered. All right, so about half says it depends. Fair enough. I agree. That's always the consulting answer. But 44% said whole kingdom, everything except for what is explicitly out of scope. And then one person said inclusive. I don't know who that one person is or who the 7 people are that answered whole kingdom, but if one of you are willing, do you mind chiming in and sharing your perspective? Was it because of some of the pros and cons that I included on here, or different ones?
Yeah. Mike, we got a question
All right.
from Ray about Copilot and Gemini and some of those other ones. Question,
Yeah.
Ray.
So feelings around AI assistance. This is Yeah, and how can AI not crack the codes? What kind of challenges does this present? So, artificial intelligence could spend the rest of the conversation a whole nother hour talking about it. Um, it is here to stay. It is going to continue to evolve. So it is absolutely a set of technologies and practices, because it's not just the technology, it's also the humans and how the humans interact with technology, right? One of the big risks from a compliance and a data protection is, how do you prevent Mike Ellerhorst from swivel chairing from my laptop that is corporate owned, corporate managed, hardened, to my personal device and type a prompt into ChatGPT that has client sensitive or company sensitive data, right? Really hard. Policy based, how do you prove it, right? Really, really hard. So I would say, these different generative AI, and in reality, I mean, a lot of it is like agent-based and agentic AI. It's poking holes in whatever boundary, whatever barrier you have, whether it is that crown jewels, whether you are just trying to protect the most important assets, or if it's the whole kingdom. These agents, these technologies they're blurring the lines of what is that boundary. And so I guess the underlying, I would say, is make sure to consider them as part of your scoping. You can decide whether you want them to be in scope or out of scope, but have an opinion, have a documented, justified reason that your management stands behind. It's a really good question. Yep, absolutely. Acceptable use policies, AI governance policies, those are, in my opinion, are a must-have for, pretty much every company in 2025. What else? Any other questions? Or anybody want to chime in and say why they agree with Crown Jewels or Whole Kingdom?
All right, maybe some time for some CMMC, the good
All
stuff.
right. All right. So we'll move on to CMMC. So this, I'll do a quick history lesson and why should you care, or why do I care, maybe, of CMMC. So CMMC is essentially where the U.S. federal government is deputizing private entities to assess and validate or score organizations on their cybersecurity posture, on their cybersecurity controls. The requirements that underpin CMMC have been in effect for almost a decade, and the companies have been contractually obligated to adhere to these requirements, when they sign a contract with the federal government. The reality is nobody's been able to check their homework, or they haven't checked their own homework. And so there are some massive examples where controlled, unclassified information, is lost, and it results in major impacts to us as a country, our defense and warfighting capabilities, and really, it enables our adversaries. And there's serious consequences for both entities and for individuals. So last week, the Department of Justice entered into an agreement with Raytheon companies for $8.4 million, where they acknowledged that they did not apply the controls and they falsely reported their compliance status to the Department of Defense from about 2016 to 2021. So $8.4 million fine. Georgia Tech had, as a research institution, had another fine. Penn State has had a massive fine. And we're only going to continue to see more of these judgments and these cases being brought by the Department of Justice. From a scope perspective, I mentioned CMMC applies for companies that do business with the Department of Defense. It also applies down the supply chain and in supporting organizations. So if your company as a consulting firm has access to your customers' CUI, you are now in scope of their CMMC assessment. And you don't want to be the one that is causing them to fail their assessment or not get the score that they need to get. And so there's both hard and soft costs associated with this of fines like Raytheon received, as well as the inability to bid on future business and future contracts with the federal government or with the supply chain. And so, for smaller entities, which there are thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of them across the US and across the world, if they cannot prove that they are meeting these requirements, they may no longer be able to partner with their largest customer, manufacturing, engineering firms, construction firms. So this extends far outside of just aerospace and defense and far outside technology companies. So that's CMMC in a nutshell, a little more than a nutshell, maybe a bowl of nuts. So what's the implication of scoping? So level 1 versus level 2, the incremental cost and level of effort for level 1 versus level 2 versus level 3 is massive. So the federal government has said implementing and assessing level 1 compliance is in the order of tens of thousands of dollars for most organizations. Level 2, we're in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to implement and operate. And if you're an enterprise of any size, you're really going to be in the millions of dollars on an annual basis to implement and maintain those compliance. And when you're at level 3, this is in tens of millions of dollars. So if you as an organization can, and so FCI is federal contract information, that is what level 1 covers. CUI is level 2 and level 3. If you as an organization take the exclusive approach, only the things that we know, we say we only have FCI and we know that FCI is only on these few systems, you can take a level 1 approach with higher confidence. That can be a huge financial, impact and the ability to prove. Enterprise versus enclave. So this is actually written into the rule where you can submit an assessment score either for your enterprise, for all of your company, or for an enclave. So for businesses that may have one contract with the government and then 15 contracts with private entities, they can create an enclave and assess against that enclave just supporting that one contract. So that is another inclusive. Another implication here kind of goes back to the cost of assessment. So depending upon how far up the ladder you are, you can either complete a self-assessment yourself. You have to document it. You have to submit it into the government's reporting system. But you don't have to pay an external auditor to come in or assessor to come in. At certain level, you have to pay a C3PAO, a certified third-party assessment organization, to come in and do your homework for you, essentially. And the last thing from a supply chain perspective is super important. And I would encourage everyone on this call, if you think that your organization may have any aerospace or defense customers, that you go talk with contracts or you look at your contracts to see if you have a flow down requirement around this. Don't assume that just because you're looking at financials and you're not looking at you know, engineering diagrams or schematics, that you're out of scope. Don't assume, because this has massive implications. And the other nuance here with the flow down obligations is primes can set a higher obligation than the federal government. So even if the prime contractor does not have to have a C3PAO assessed or validated score, they may require that their subcontractors have a certified score. So it's there's a lot of nuance here, which could have massive impacts in how much it costs and the time to implement it, and the consequences of not being compliant with CMMC. And yes, it is disturbing, and it's a reality, and it's where we're at, and with a lot of the changes that are happening in Washington with DOGE and the 10-to-1 executive order that's been posted, most industry experts believe that CMMC is not going anywhere. It is actually a clear mechanism to identify, detect, and prevent fraud, misuse, and waste. And it's, there are a lot of different numbers that have been put out there, but by not implementing cybersecurity controls, some of these big organizations, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, have lost or misused thousands, millions, billions of dollars of government spending. So CMMC is not going away, and we will continue to see and feel implications of it. I look at it very much like SOX, like Sarbanes-Oxley, where that was a fundamental shift in industry and the way that financial reporting was managed. This is a similar, going to be a broad-reaching fundamental shift in the way that organizations have to approach and manage their cybersecurity posture. You guys can read my takeaways. I've been talking a lot today. I will pop onto the last slide, questions, thoughts, reactions. Here's my information. Please reach out. I'm based in, I didn't do this as part of my initial introduction, but I'm based in Colorado, closer up to Boulder. I live in Lafayette. NTM has been around for about 2 years. We have supported organizations from a 2-person law firm in Boulder all the way up to multi-billion-dollar publicly traded entities. We primarily focus on and support the proactive side of cybersecurity. So risk management, compliance management, preparation, security strategy, and vCISO, if you haven't heard that term, virtual CISO or a fractional security leader, is also a role that my firm will provide, especially for smaller companies where it doesn't make sense financially to have a security leader on staff. Yeah, I'll leave it at that, and I'll open it up for any other questions.
Any questions for Mike? Surely there's got to be one question out there.
Did I completely miss the mark and everybody fell asleep?
It's the post-sandwich lunch, right? Here we go.
Right.
Well, Mike, let me ask you something.
Sure.
I work in the government contracting space a lot myself from a CFO controller standpoint. NFI, and I've had to reach out from time to time because my clients all of a sudden get a contract that has FAR Part 52 or DFAR, something that's going on there. And, they were like, oh, what is this level one CMMC stuff? And what would be your advice to people that have clients that are in that space or need some help or advice? How do you go about finding out what your requirements are and are there resources out there if you could?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of actually pretty good resources that are out freely available that have been produced and made public. One is called Project Spectrum. I'll actually see if I can drop a link to it in the chat. And especially for firms that are, not squarely in the yes, we are absolutely in scope for CMMC, Boeing, Lockheed, they know. They've known they're part of it, right? And they're direct suppliers. But, when we're getting into the 20-person, 50-person manufacturing firm, engineering firm, it's a lot less cut and dry. And Project Spectrum has some really good resources. They do webinars. Reach out to me. I'm more than happy to have the conversation. And if you're on the fence, I would say, and actually Jim and I were talking about this before we all got started.
Mhm.
Level one, I think it's 14 foundational safeguards
Mhm.
are great for every company, regardless of whether you're in, defense contracting or not. Those are things like making sure you have multi-factor authentication enabled, making sure that you have an inventory of the systems, the applications, and the devices that are accessing your environment. So they are, regardless of whether you must, report your score to the US government, looking at and starting the journey for that level one is a valuable exercise.
Gotcha. And then
Um,
Mike, you and I were talking about NIST standards too. I mean, if you want to
yep.
do a nightly go to sleep stuff, there's some NIST standards that are out there, right? That some people can look at other kind of parallel CMMC. So,
Yep. Yep.
okay.
Yeah, and Tony asked the question, is CMMC only applicable to defense industry? Yes and no. So the rule that has been published is for defense contractors, and currently the Department of Justice is only bringing litigation against defense contractors or research organizations that support DoD, fall in there. Actually, a lot of other governments, so the Canadian government and the Mexican government, have been looking at CMMC, and NIST 800-171 is the actual controls framework that sits underneath CMMC. And that they are starting to consider including those in legislation for their own countries. Other parts of the US government, the Department of Energy has C2M2 because they couldn't do CMMC. They wanted CCMM, whatever. Fundamentally, it's the same thing. So, like level one controls and most of the level two controls are good practices that organizations of any size will benefit from. The nuances for CMMC, there are certain things around like data encryption and reporting standards. Those are unique to Department of Defense, but it's definitely the 80-20 rule, if not 95%, 5%, where 95% are valuable and applicable regardless of the industry, the entity, and 5% are very specific to DoD.
Mike, I think one of the things that you do a lot of that I think our audience needs to know is you advise and support boards of directors, right?
Yep.
You do a lot of that work, and maybe talk about, how we can help our clients or even our own companies that have boards of directors, and maybe talk about how you can help with risk mitigation, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And both CMMC and last year there were new rules, 2023, new rules that were put in place around publicly traded companies under the SEC, where there is increased disclosure expectation of cybersecurity expertise at the board and obligation or consequence to senior executives and to the board when cyber events occur. So under CMMC, there is somebody that is named as the authorizing official who, in effect, is taking an oath. When they are submitting the score, they are taking an oath that this is true and fair and accurate of what they're representing. And they may be individually liable if, to the Department of Justice under False Claims Acts, they could be personally liable, not just corporate. They could be personally liable to the DOJ and criminal charges. So the consequences, there's an expectation that senior leadership and boards are participating, and the consequences of not participating are continuing to go up. So have the conversations. I don't like always being doom and gloom, but it's a scary world out there, and it's important to protect, and to be intentional about how we're looking at managing our systems, managing our risk. So.
Right. Any other questions for Mike? All right. Tiffany, you have any closing thoughts? And we'll thank Mike and thank him for his time today.
Yeah, thank you again, Mike. You are amazing. We really appreciate all the information. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Your CPE will be available as soon as we shut down this feed. And so then you can take your survey and get your certificate. But if you have any questions or if you need anything from me, please feel free to reach out directly, Tiffany@cocpa.org. Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Jim, for bringing us Mike. And thanks so much, Mike, for jumping in and speaking today. Have a great day, everyone.
All right. Thank you all. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Cheers.